Welcome to the last session of our three-part series on early American Jewish history. I'm Dr. Joellyn Zollman, your guide on this journey to explore the origins of American Jewish life. And I am delighted to close out our series tonight with one of my favorite subjects, Jews and the American Revolution. Now, I almost lost my voice when I was talking to you guys last time. I talked so much that night, and this is a topic I like to talk a lot about. So I've got my hot tea, so I'm prepared to talk as long as it takes tonight for you guys with Jews and the American Revolution. When we last left our colonial American Jewish community, they had numbered some 2,500 souls who had settled and established congregations in 5 coastal communities. And we spent our time together last week looking at those 5 coastal communities, right? In Newport, New York, Philadelphia, Savannah, and Charleston. And one of the things that we learned in our time together last week was that each one of these cities boasted one congregation, right? There was one single Sephardic synagogue in New York, one in Newport, one in Philadelphia, one in Charleston, and one in Savannah. And in all of these places, in that single synagogue, all the community's functions occurred. And those functions occurred according to 3 strategies, or Jews used 3 strategies to organize their communities in all of these colonial coastal towns. And the strategies that Jews employed were tradition and deference and compartmentalization. You can see them up there on the slide: tradition, deference, and compartmentalization. Now that we've got that all down, we're going to see how it changes. Are you ready for a revolution? About 2,500 Jews were living in the 13 American colonies in 1776, and they weren't at all sure that they were ready for a revolution. We can see this ambivalence in an extraordinary prayer penned by the Hazan, the prayer leader of Congregation Shereth Israel in New York in the spring of 1776. So just 2 months before the start of the American Revolution, during a time of great political unrest and instability in colonial America, our Continental Congress called upon the colonists to observe May 17th, 1776, as a day of fasting and prayer. The idea here was that the colonists pray for a peaceful and favorable resolution to our escalating conflict with Great Britain. Take a look on your screen to see how Gershon Seixas, who, by the way, is the brother of Abraham Mendes Seixas from Charleston, who we met last week. This is his brother. You can see him pictured up here on the screen. And this is how Gershon Seixas answered the Continental Congress's call to prayer. This is a prayer he wrote himself. Now, he wrote it in Hebrew and Judeo-Portuguese. We are going to read the translation in English tonight. And you can see the prayer up there translated in English on your screen. I'm going to read it, and then we can talk about what it tells us about Jews in New York on the eve of the American Revolution. O Lord, may it please thee to put in the heart of our sovereign Lord, George III, and in the hearts of his counselors, princes, and servants, to turn away their fierce wrath from against North America and to destroy the wicked devices of our enemies, that it may fall on their own heads, that there may no more blood be shed in these countries. O God, we beseech you to open unto us the gates of mercy on this our solemn fast, and that our prayers and the prayers of all the people that stand before you this day may come before you, that war may no more pass through our land, and that you may send the angels of mercy to proclaim peace to all America and to the inhabitants thereof. That you may once more plant an everlasting peace between Great Britain and her colonies as in former times, and confirm unto us what is written, quote, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. So this is quite a document, right? What do we see here? What do we see here? I would argue that what we see here is a little bit of confusion when it comes to messaging. On the one hand, in Gershom Mendes Seixas's prayer, we see acknowledgement of George III as sovereign, as king, and the prayer asks, as the Continental Congress requested, for peace. So we're acknowledging George III as sovereign, and the prayer is asking for peace, but this prayer is also calling King George out, along with his counselors and their servants, for their fierce wrath against the colonies. It accuses the king of clear wrongdoing without suggesting that the colonies have anything to regret or reform. In short, this prayer calls for two things: for peace and for King George to behave better. This is a bold move. It's not clear whether or not Seixas sees King George as capable of change, but what is clear is that Seixas and his congregation felt comfortable criticizing the King of England. This is notable. Remember last week we talked about how the operative word when it came to the British and religious tolerance in colonial times was quietness, right? We talked about that when we looked at the Toro Synagogue last week. The British would allow religious dissent as long as it was done quietly and politely and did not offend the government. Well, Seixas and his congregation here are not behaving quietly. They are not behaving necessarily politely, but they are potentially here offending the government. They're speaking up. They're loudly and clearly criticizing King George here. Now, this is a bold move, and it's a bold move that you only make if you feel pretty safe and pretty comfortable in your corner of the world. In fact, I would argue that the creation and the delivery of this prayer shows that Seixas and his congregation saw themselves as part of the colonist community. When Congress called for people to pray, Seixas didn't hesitate to instruct his congregation to participate. These early American Jews were invested in the fate of the colonies. They had built lives and families, businesses and congregations here. Early American Jews saw themselves as a portion of the people, as part of this place. And our aim tonight is to explore how these feelings of belonging inspired the vast majority of colonial American Jews to become first patriots and later citizens of a new nation. Together tonight, we'll examine how American Jews impacted the American Revolution, and then how America's revolutionary ideas of democracy and representation impacted American Judaism. Let's start with the American Jewish impact on the American Revolution. So in the struggle between the colonies and England, most American Jews supported the colonies' quest for independence. There were a few Jews who supported the British, but the vast majority of American Jews supported independence. Why? Why would the vast majority of American Jews support independence? Well, most American Jewish colonists supported independence, supported the American Revolution, because they believed in the liberal ideas of the revolution, and because the activities of the British were having a negative impact on their livelihoods. Colonial American Jews were, with few exceptions, merchants. We talked about this last time, right? Some of these merchants were involved in international trade, while others were involved with smaller business in the colonies. Some of them were craftspeople selling goods to their neighbors. But regardless of the level at which individuals functioned as a mercantile people, their livelihood depended on the free flow of goods as well as on the goodwill of their neighbors. As those of you who've taken American history classes know the British were threatening exactly that, the free flow of trade on the eve of the Revolution. I'm going to share a couple of sentences about the American Revolution here to provide some context. In 1763, the British king, King George III, who we were just talking about and addressing in that prayer, King George III in 1763 issued a royal proclamation that was prompted by an uprising of Native Americans led by the Ottawa chief Pontiac. This royal proclamation restricted European settlement to the area east of the Appalachian Mountains in order to prevent new wars with Native American peoples living in the interior. So if you take a look at the map on your screen, you can locate the Appalachian Mountains there, and you can see the geography of what we're talking about. Now, this restriction on settlement threatened the investment of many businessmen and traders, including many Jews, because they had made in these territories to the west of the Appalachians all kinds of forays into business. So this restrictive British Act was followed by a series of more restrictive British acts, including the Currency Act and the Sugar Act of 1764, for example, which involved new tariffs and also placed tighter administrative controls on coastal shipping. In addition, well-publicized discussions were taking place in London about taxing the colonies for the support of British troops in Canada and other frontier outposts. Reform of the empire was clearly underway, and this was coming after more than 50 years of benign neglect. These new regulations alarmed the colonists. Thus, in 1765, when the British government acted to raise revenues by levying for the first time a direct tax on the colonists, people were very concerned. The colonists were very concerned. I'm talking here about the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required colonists to buy and place revenue stamps on all official legal documents, deeds, newspapers, pamphlets, dice, and playing cards. Colonists strongly opposed, the Stamp Act. Ordinary people had always been lightly taxed in America, and they did not want their money to be used to support British officials. So you can see how Jews, as a mercantile people in the colonies, were adversely affected by these acts passed by the British. For these reasons, as well as a general affinity for the liberal ideals of the Patriots, when hostilities broke out, some 150 Jewish men expressed their support for independence by taking up arms and fighting on the side of the colonists, enlisting in the Continental Army and the various militias. Now, we met two of these soldiers last week, Francis Salvador and Abraham Mendes Seixas. Both of these men were from the community of Charleston. We're going to go farther south today, and we're going to meet some more patriots from Savannah. When the Revolutionary War broke out, most of Savannah's Jews rallied to the patriotic cause. Mordecai Sheftal, who you see pictured up there on the screen, a Jewish resident who was born in Savannah, but whose parents came to Savannah on the original shipload of Jewish refugees there in 1733, Mordecai Sheftal was appointed upon the outbreak of the revolution to lead Savannah's parochial committee, which was basically the Patriot City Council in Savannah. He was joined on this committee by his co-religionists, Levi and Philip Minnis. So this is astonishing, right? On the Patriot Civil Council, which was less than 10 men, there are 3 Jews on this council. When the British attacked Savannah in late 1778, Mordecai Sheftal not only took an active part in defense of the city, but he also advanced considerable sums of money, including loans, for the American cause. After the city had been taken, he and his son were captured by the British. As a consequence of refusing to renounce his loyalty to the Patriot cause, the British took him to a prison ship called the Nancy with his son, Sheftal, and kept both of them there. Mordecai Sheftal and Sheftal were kept on this prison ship as prisoners of war. Now, on the ship, the Sheftals refused to eat the pork that the British gave to them because they kept kosher. They kept the Jewish dietary laws. To taunt them, the British captors ordered their cutlery to be smeared in pork grease, knowing that they would then refuse all of the food. In February of 1779, the Sheftals were told that they would be released. However, on their way north, they were captured again and exiled to the Caribbean island of Antigua. Both Sheftals will ultimately survive the war, return to Savannah, and the older one, Mordecai, will become president of the congregation Mikveh Israel there. Now we have something really quite wonderful to look at together today, a letter that lends some insight into Sheftal and his family's experiences during the war. The letter, which comes to us from the collection of the American Jewish Historical Society, was written by Frances Sheftal, who you can see pictured up there too. This is a letter that she wrote to her husband, Mordecai Sheftal, while he was imprisoned in Antigua. Now, Frances is writing from Charlestown, where she has taken refuge from the fighting in Savannah during the American Revolution. She has with her their 4 young children, aged 7, 9, 11, and 15. They've all fled Savannah. They fled the British there. They have no access to the family's money in Savannah, only what she could grab and take with them. And Savannah's under British control, so they don't have easy access to their resources, nor can they go back. So in just a minute, I'm going to read to you Frances's account of her early days in Charlestown. As you're listening, think about how incredible it is to have a voice, a Jewish woman's voice at that, reach out to us from 1780 to share her life experiences. What can we learn from Frances Sheftal about American Jewish life in the South during the Revolutionary War? Think about that. And also note as I'm reading it that the letter is transcribed here exactly as Frances wrote it, including her unusual spelling. English as a language, for those of you who might not know, has standardization comes to English quite late. It's not really until the late 1700s or early 1800s, after the American Revolution, that the English language becomes at all standardized. So that's why in a lot of these early documents, you see what looks to us like some very creative spelling. So this is Frances Sheftal writing to her husband, Mordecai Sheftal, in 1780. Remember, Mordecai is in prison and Frances has had to flee with their young children to Charlestown. My dear Sheftal, I have now the pleasure to inform you that I received your letter dated May the 5th and sincerely congratulate you on your impending release, hoping we may once more meet again in a great deal of pleasure, for I can assure you that we have been strangers to that for some time past. But I still hope that our troubles will now soon be at an end. I make not the least doubt that you have heard that this place, Charlestown, was given over to the British troops on May 12th by a capitulation after 3 months' siege. During that time, I retired to the country with my family, and a great many of our people, Jews, were at the same place. During the siege, there was scarce a woman to be seen in the streets. The balls flew like hail during this cannonading. After the town was given over, I returned to town and have hired a house in St. Michael's Alley belonging to Mrs. Stevens at a rate of £50 sterling a year. And where the money is to come from, God only knows, for there is nothing but hard money goes here, and that, I can assure you, is hard enough to be got. I am obliged to take in needlework to make living for my family, so I leave you to judge what a living that must be. Our Negroes have every one been at the point of death, so that they have been of no use to me for these past 6 weeks, but thanks be to God, they are all getting better of it, except for poor little Billy. He died with the yellow fever on the 3rd of July. The children have all got safe over the smallpox. They had it so favorable that Perla had the most and had but 30 pockmarks. How I shall be able to pay the doctor's bill and house rent, God only knows, but I still trust in Providence, knowing that the Almighty never sends trouble, but he sends some relief. We have had no less than 6 Jewish children buried since the siege. And poor Mrs. Cardoso, Miss Leah Torres, that was, died last week with the smallpox. Mr. de Leon has lost 2 grandchildren. Mrs. Mordecai has lost her child. Mrs. Myers Moses had the misfortune to have her youngest daughter, Miss Rachel, killed with the nurse by a cannonball during the siege. I have nothing more at present but wish to hear from you by the first opportunity. The children join me in love to you and their brother, and I remain your loving wife, Frances Sheftal. It's a really amazing letter, right? This letter is a treasure. And we can learn from Frances Sheftal a lot, I think, about American Jewish life, generally in American Jewish life in the South at the time of the Revolutionary War. Sheftal talks to us, tells us something about Southern Jews and slavery here. She tells us about the challenging nature of life in the colonies, especially the devastating role that disease played in the colonists' lives, right? We see yellow fever and smallpox here. And she renders in detail the terrifying and devastating nature of life during wartime. This is all incredible information. I am absolutely happy to talk about it. I don't want to go on for too long because we've got a lot of material to cover, but if there are any of these topics that you want to tease out, that you want to talk more about, please bring them up again in the Q&A at the end of tonight's lecture. I'm happy to talk about Jews and slavery, happy to talk about the colonists and their experience of their entire families during the Revolutionary War, because one of the things that Sheftal shows us here is that the Revolutionary War affects more than just the soldiers who fought in it, right? It reminds us that war isn't just happening on battlefields, but has an impact on the whole population in the place where fighting occurs. So when we widen our lens kind of beyond the battlefield, it allows us to consider other ways that Jews supported the patriot cause, including movements that their families had to make, and also different roles that Jews could have played in the revolution. In addition to the role of soldiers, Jews played important roles as bankers, merchants, and suppliers in the American Revolution. Now, most famously in this realm, we have the story of Chaim Solomon. I would be shocked if you had not heard of Chaim Solomon before. You can see on the screen just a few of the tributes, of the statues, of the plaques, of the books that address Chaim Solomon, the most famous Jewish patriot. Chaim Solomon was, you might not know this, a Sephardic Jew. He came to the United States from Poland, but prior to that, his family was originally from the Iberian Peninsula. He comes during the partitions of Poland. We're not sure exactly when. Sometime between 1770 and 1775, Chaim Solomon arrives in New York. He is very much drawn to the colonies by the freedom that's offered to Jews here. So unsurprisingly, soon after he arrives, he joins the Sons of Liberty, this organization of patriots in New York. And then when the British invade New York in 1776, Solomon, who had been living there for really just a couple of years at that point, joins with other Jews from the city and relocates to Philadelphia. Now, Chaim Solomon's service to the patriot cause comes not from soldiering, but rather from fundraising for the revolutionaries. The Continental Congress appointed him to act as a broker for their treasury. In this position, he orchestrated substantial loans from France and Holland for the United States. From the period from 1781 to 1784, records show that Chaim Solomon's fundraising and personal lending helped provide over $650,000 in financing to George Washington. That would be approximately $16 million in today's money. The most meaningful financial contribution, as historians understand it now, that Chaim Solomon made came to, was for the battle, rather, of Yorktown. In August of 1781, the British general Charles Cornwallis and his troops were were penned in near Yorktown. Washington's army held Cornwallis surrounded. They had Cornwallis surrounded, but because Congress was essentially out of money, the Continental troops hadn't been paid in some time. They were low on rations. They were low on crucial uniform components. In fact, Washington's soldiers were close to staging a coup. Many were considering desertion as a better option than staying in Yorktown. According to legend, Washington wrote to Robert Morris, his superintendent of finance, and asked him to send Chaim Zollman. Zollman then managed to secure $20,000 in finances that Washington needed to keep his men fighting. And ultimately, as we know, the British were defeated at Yorktown in what would be the final major battle of the American Revolution. After the war ended, Zollman brokered numerous loans between other nations and the newly formed United States government. Sadly, Chaim Zollman's financial efforts during the war led to his downfall. He had loaned out hundreds of thousands of dollars during the revolution, and because of the unstable economy in the colonies, most private borrowers and also many government entities were unable to repay their loans. So in 1785, when he died at the age of 44, his family was nearly penniless. He died, by the way, of tuberculosis, which he contracted in prison. The British caught him at one point, accused him of spying, and put him in prison. He was later able to escape, but he did not escape with his good health. He took with him tuberculosis, which ultimately would kill him. He is buried at his synagogue, Mikveh Israel, in Philadelphia. So Chaim Zollman is, without question, the best known and most significant of the Jewish financiers of the revolution, but he was not the only Jewish banker or merchant to help support the Continental cause. I want to also introduce you tonight to Michael and Bernard Gratz. You can see them up there on your screen. These brothers were also from Poland, although they are Ashkenazim. They came to Philadelphia in the 1750s. These brothers were merchants who had business ventures that took them in all sorts of different directions, but one of the directions that it took them in was west through those Appalachian Mountains that we had just looked at on the map a few slides ago. The Gratz brothers established trading posts in Pittsburgh and Louisville, which were quite west at that time, which were, sort of on the western edge of civilization. They also had bought interest in what was known as an outfit known as the Illinois Company, which was a firm that was helping to develop the Midwest for European settlement. So for merchants like the Gratz brothers, you can see how those British restrictions on trade and settlement west of the Appalachians would have been a disaster. It's not surprising then that when war broke out, the Gratz brothers sided with the Patriots and really used a lot of their mercantile connections, which were quite widespread, to supply arms and clothing to the Continental Army. Finally, I want to share the story of one more patriot who played a key role in supplying the Continental Army, and that's Abigail Minnis. Abigail Minnis is another Jew from Savannah. She was a businesswoman, she was a landowner, and she was known for her support of the revolutionary cause. With her husband and her two young daughters, she was among that first group of approximately 40 Jews who came to settle in Savannah in July of 1733, which is very soon after the founding of that colony by Governor James Oglethorpe. Between 1733, when she arrived, and 1757, she gave birth to 7 children. She already had 2 on the boat when she came over, and so she gave birth to 7 more. And so she had 9. Then she was widowed soon after the birth of her last child, and she was only 56 years old and had all those children to support. Now, Abigail Minnis was not, however, a shrinking violet. She was a very intelligent woman and worked tirelessly to support her family, and in the process went on to build a small fortune in land ownership. She was also widely known as a supporter of revolutionary causes, and helped supply provisions for the Continental Line, the Georgia militia, and the French forces in the area. Attempts were made by the British to confiscate her property after Savannah fell to the British in December of 1778. However, Minnis and her daughters successfully petitioned the governor for safe passage to Charleston and protection of their Savannah property for the remainder of the war. So in all of these ways, as soldiers, as merchants, as financiers, Jews played a role in the American Revolution. Next, we'll take a look at how the American Revolution had a profound and lasting effect on American Jews. Most immediately, wartime conditions caused massive human dislocation. When the British occupied New York in 1776, the majority of the members of Shearith Israel congregation there fled. They took their Torah scrolls and their other ritual objects, and they got themselves to Philadelphia. Their co-religionists there at Mikveh Israel congregation welcomed them. The flight of Shearith Israel to Philadelphia demonstrated both Jewish support for the revolutionary cause and the bonds of community and unity that linked American Jews to one another. Not only did the Jews of New York find refuge among the Jews of Philadelphia, but so did the rest of the Jews who were living in places that the British would eventually inhabit as well. So Jews who were fleeing British occupation in Newport, in Savannah, and eventually also in Charleston would come to Philadelphia and find refuge with other Jews there. Now, these wartime migrations had lasting effects. People who had never met Jews before encountered them for the first time and learned how similar they were to everyone else. Also, Jews from different parts of the country met each other and made lasting friendships, as well as marriages and business partnerships. And finally, the distribution of Jews in the colonies changed as a result of the revolution. Newport, Rhode Island, formerly one of the 5 largest Jewish communities in America, saw its port destroyed in the war. Consequently, Newport's fortunes fell and its Jewish community scattered. On the other hand, 2 cities that were spared destruction, Philadelphia and Charleston, emerged from the Revolutionary War with larger, better organized, thriving Jewish communities. In the war's aftermath, American Jews moved to confirm their place in the new country. And I want to mention tonight 2 public displays of American Jewish patriotism that occurred just after the war. First, in 1788, there was a grand federal procession, a parade, in honor of the newly ratified American Constitution. This parade was held in Philadelphia and symbolized really in remarkable fashion the tension between the Jewish desire to belong and the Jewish need to be separate. Jews participated fully in this parade and its celebration of the Constitution. Their leaders walked arm in arm with clergy of different denominations in the parade. Yet, at the conclusion of the ceremony, Jews ate apart at a separate kosher table that had been set aside for them at the end of the parade route. This was appropriate in the eyes of the Constitution. Each religion was equal, yet each also enjoyed the right to remain distinctive and unique. This was the first public display of Jewish American patriotism that, as you can see, it's about loyalty, but it's also about defining a place for a religious minority in American society. The second, also very telling act of public patriotism by the American Jewish community after the Revolutionary War was a series of letters exchanged between various Jewish congregations and President George Washington. The most famous and oft quoted of these letters came from the then rapidly vanishing congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. This letter was written in 1790 to welcome George Washington. who was planning to visit the city following Rhode Island's ratification of the Constitution. The Newport letter suggests that Jews wanted to be seen again as both a part of and also apart from American society, just as they had in the parade. So in the letter, they state that they join with their fellow citizens in welcoming the president to Newport, showing that they're part of the community and they'll take part in the community celebration. Yet the Jews still want a separate letter because they have some separate concerns, some concerns apart from the concerns of their fellow citizens. The Jews of Newport wrote that Jews had experienced discrimination in the past, and they praised the government for generously affording to all liberty and conscience. They thanked God in their letter for the blessings of civil and religious liberty that Jews enjoyed under the Constitution. And what they're doing in this letter is prompting Washington to say, yes, you are really going to get these rights. Yes, we made a promise and we're going to follow through with it in this new nation. Now, George Washington, in his oft-quoted reply to the Jews of Newport, also in 1790, aimed to then reassure these Jews of their place in the new nation. Washington wrote, and you can see this on the screen, that the United States would give to bigotry, quote, to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. Washington assured the Jews that the founding fathers saw religious liberty as a natural right, distinct from the religious tolerance practiced by much of enlightened Europe, where Jewish emancipation was so often linked with demands for Jewish improvement. Not in America, promised Washington. Indeed, America, Washington hinted, might prove something of a promised land for Jews, a place where they might, quote, merit and enjoy the goodwill of other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid, quote. That is an astonishing promise in 1790 to the Jewish people. If you think only of where else they're living in the world, where they're not promised any of that kind of liberty or security. There was a wonderful exhibition that featured this letter and really did a deep dive into George Washington and these communities that he corresponded with at the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. Maybe some of you saw it some years ago there. I'm happy to talk more about this letter and more about George Washington and the Jews in the Q&A period later, if you're interested. Okay, thus, from the very foundation of the country, as soon as the country was formed, America was promising Jews something different, something better. And in these two acts, the parade and the letter that I just spoke about, we see American Jews testing the waters of religious tolerance and religious equality and being reassured that they were separate and equal, at least on the national level. It's important to keep in mind that while America was different for Jews, it wasn't perfect. American Jews were subjects of persecution and prejudice, social and political, on account of their religion. While the Constitution and the Bill of Rights outlawed religious tests for any office and forbade Congress from making any law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, these were constitutional guarantees at the national level. They were not binding on the states. The states could legislate as they pleased. This is true until the passage of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The Constitution gives the states rights to determine qualifications for state and local elections. Now, New York was the first state to guarantee liberty of conscience to all native born, regardless of religion. They did that in 1777. Most states followed New York's lead, with the exception of New Jersey, Maryland, North Carolina, and the New England states. In these states, legislatures required government officials to take a Protestant oath. So in New Jersey, in Maryland, in North Carolina, and in the New England states, legislatures required government officials to take a Protestant oath. If the individual refused the oath, he could not serve the state. Now, the implications of this were absurd. Theoretically, a Jew could be president of the United States, but was ineligible to hold the lowliest political office, like dog catcher, say, in Maryland or North Carolina or New Jersey or New England. Realizing this, the majority of states granted Jews full rights by 1830. However, New Hampshire held out until 1877. Full rights, however, had only limited effects on social equality. Many Americans still viewed Jews with a great deal of suspicion. Jews realized that they could win equality in popular eyes only by demonstrating that being Jewish in no way conflicted with being American. They had to prove that non-Christians could still be loyal and devoted citizens. As we've seen, they took steps in this direction by fighting in and supporting America's Great Revolutionary War, by exchanging letters with President George Washington, and as we shall see next, by reorganizing their synagogues according to democratic principles. In the wake of the American Revolution, Jews faced the question of whether Judaism as they knew it could be reconciled with America's new spirit of freedom and democracy. Could Jews maintain the traditional structure that bound them together and promote group survival, and yet at the same time also accommodate new political and cultural and religious realities? Well, in an initial effort to meet this challenge, every American synagogue rewrote its constitution. More precisely, they wrote constitutions for the first time. They had previously called their governing documents askamot or haskamot, meaning agreements or covenants. The new documents broke from the old Sephardic model, incorporated large amounts of Republican rhetoric, and provided for a great deal more freedom and democracy, at least on paper. New York's one and only congregation, Shearith Israel, wrote a particularly notable constitution in 1790. This new set of laws began in a way that should sound very familiar to you. Quote, "We, the members of KK Shearith Israel." Now, what does this echo? The preamble to the American Constitution, right? "We, the people of the United States. We, the members of KK Shearith Israel." But that's not all. These members of Shearith Israel penned at the end of their constitution an actual Bill of Rights. They had an actual Bill of Rights. And you can see some excerpted text from that Bill of Rights on the screen. I just want to read the first one out loud up here for you so that you can get a sense of what it sounded like. Whereas in free states, oh, I blocked my own screen there. Well, that's weird. Give me a sec here. All power originates and is derived from the people. We can start right there, right? Whereas in free states, all power originates and is derived from the people. That is language of democracy and representation, right? That's trickle down language from the American Constitution, from the Declaration of Independence. You can see in this Constitution, if you keep reading on the screen, excerpts from it up there, you can see these American ideas filtering down into these traditional Jewish documents. In summary, what this Bill of Rights does and what this new constitution does for Shearith Israel is really explicitly end many of the colonial era distinctions between members and non-members in a congregation. And it does this by declaring that every free person who declares the Jewish religion and who lives according to its principles is entitled to membership in the congregation. Leadership would no longer rest, as it had in the colonial period, with a self-perpetuating elite. This is the idea of democracy trickling down into the synagogue, of natural rights trickling down into the synagogue. And you can see an even more democratic constitution, an even more radical constitution being produced in 1789 by a fledgling congregation in Richmond, Virginia. This congregation was called Beth Shalom. It's not an accident that in times of war, you get congregations that name themselves after peace, right? So Beth Shalom congregation, Shalom, of course, meaning peace, they wrote a constitution that was really quite radical. It began, quote, "We, the subscribers of the Israelite religion, resident of this place, desirous of promoting divine worship." And you can see again on your screen some similar sentiments here. "Every free man residing in the city for the term of 3 months shall be a first-class member and be entitled to all the rights and privileges of the same. The parnas and the assistant shall not be connected in family or in partnership in trade, in order to preserve an equal and an independent representation." With these words, Beth Shalom's constitution outlawed the traditional practice of having only wealthy families run the synagogue. In colonial New York, for example, interconnected merchant families had dominated congregational life for more than 50 years, and such was the case in much of modern Europe. Post-revolutionary Richmond Jews rebelled against this undemocratic practice. You see the phrase here, an equal and independent representation. That's particularly revealing. These were good Virginia values in 1789, but they were by no means traditional Jewish values. And then you have that excellent last little excerpt there. "No rules or regulations shall be considered as binding on the congregation until it is read 2 Sabbath and holidays separately in the synagogue. Should any member object to the same, it must be by a letter to the parnas within 24 hours of the last publication, who shall be obliged to call a meeting of all of the members. A majority present at such a meeting, which must be 2/3 of the members in town, shall determine the same." So you've got this 2/3 principle here. This provision of the Richmond Synagogue Constitution promotes the value of communal consensus by offering dissenters unprecedented opportunity to have their views heard. Even a single dissenter could bring a meeting of all of the congregation, all the members. This practice had never been normative in American synagogue life. It was totally impractical. The intent, nevertheless, is kind of fascinating, right? It's just interesting. For a key source of dissatisfaction within colonial era synagogues was the stifling of dissenting voices. And here they have a vehicle for those voices to be heard. So this is a really interesting document, and there are other synagogue constitutions like this that show us how American Judaism is struggling to adopt and then adapt to the values of democracy and representation that really fueled the American Revolution. So they're looking at these ideas of individual freedom and saying, how does it apply to us? How does it apply to our religion? You can see it in these constitutions, and you can also see it in the expanding space, literally and figuratively, for Jewish women in American synagogues. Now, American Jewish women benefited from the new spirit of freedom after the American Revolution. At Shereth Israel Synagogue, for example, in the spirit of democracy, the special bench reserved for the aristocratic women of the Gomez family was removed in 1786. And in 1805, the congregation abandoned its controversial status-based system of assigning and rating seats for men and women. Instead, the congregation began renting them out on a first-come, first-served basis. In 1818, when the original synagogue was torn down and a larger one built in its place in New York, the women's gallery was transformed even more, new construction serving here as a spur to religious innovation. First of all, in this new Shereth Israel building, the number of seats available for women in the gallery increased in the new synagogue. giving women 44% of the total seats in the synagogue, an indication that women were expected to attend synagogue services. We talked about this last time. In Europe, Jewish women didn't go to synagogue. Their role in Judaism was private and domestic. They might show up on the holidays, but they were not consistently going to Shabbat services. This was different in colonial America. Remember, the communities are small. Their Christian neighbors went to church, so these women went to church. They saw the women who lived next door going to church, so the Jewish women said, we too will go to our church, which is the synagogue. So they're showing up, and now, the synagogue is making space for them, literally. Second, women came down from the gallery in the new Shereth Israel to sing as part of a mixed choir at the new synagogue's dedication. The decision to form such a choir suggests that women were seeking new modes of expression within the synagogue. Mixed choirs also soon showed up in Philadelphia and in Charleston. Third, women gained heightened visibility in the new 1818 synagogue because they no longer sat behind a screen. The screen was not installed in this new 1818 synagogue. They were given an unobstructed view of the bima. So they're still sitting in a gallery, to be clear, but they don't have that big mechitza, the screen, in front of them. And this created a new problem in the American synagogue, which was called vertical flirting, which is just such a great term, right? Vertical flirting. I think you can figure that out. And some congregations tried to ban single women from sitting in the front of the balcony for exactly that reason, for the reason of vertical flirting. Philadelphia's synagogue soon followed suit with the same open gallery style in 1824, and a new tradition was confirmed. American Judaism now offered Jewish women more freedom to feel part of the general synagogue worship than anywhere else in the world. The American Revolution and the beliefs flowing from it created really a cultural ferment over the meaning of freedom. And you could see this in Judaism. You could also, by the way, see it in Christianity at the time, which is as Judaism was grappling with issues of authority and organization and leadership. And so really the first third of the 19th century in this country is a real period of religious ferment, religious chaos, and religious originality. There are two examples of this that I want to close with tonight that illustrate the kinds of challenges that synagogue communities faced. Young Jews in two of America's largest Jewish communities, in Charleston and in New York, challenged synagogue authority in the early 19th century, causing nothing short of a religious revolution in the 1820s that overthrew the synagogue community and transformed American Judaism. Let's set the stage here. At this time, the Jewish community after the revolution was still small, but growing. There are about 3,000 to 6,000 Jews over the early decades of the 19th century, but more Jews than ever before were native born, and the number of Jewish immigrants from Central and Western Europe was growing. It was during this time that American Jews became seriously alarmed about what we would call Jewish continuity. In New York and Charleston and Philadelphia, Jews expressed concern about Jewish religious indifference, apathy, and neglect. They worried about the future. While many of these complaints focused on religious laxity, the real question was whether or not the colonial system of Judaism, this one synagogue in every community, one Sephardic synagogue in every place, could adequately meet the needs of young Jews and meet the needs of a growing Jewish community. Many of these communities were peopled by Jews who were born here, and some who were born after the revolution, who were caught up in this kind of heady 19th century atmosphere of freedom and democracy and religious ferment, and responding to these larger ideas and ideals. Young Jews in the two largest American Jewish communities where Jews live, New York and Charleston, moved to transform and revitalize their faith. In doing so, they wanted to bring Jews back to active observance of their religion. The young Jews in New York petitioned the Board of Trustees at Shereth Israel for changes. Now, think about this. What do you expect these mostly young, mostly native-born American Jews would want to change about a Sephardic service in the early 1820s? No, I don't know. How about everything? Just about everything. First of all, they wanted to change the language. These are Jews who are native English speakers, right? They grew up in America. They don't know Judeo-Portuguese. They don't know Ladino. This service, the language of the service is inaccessible to them. They feel it's foreign and it's not American. They want the language of the service to change to English. They would like also a sermon. They want some kind of instruction about the Torah portion to translate for them, to explain to them, to discuss with them what they are studying. They also asked for a shorter service because the service was quite long in the Sephardic synagogue. So they're looking for different language. They're looking for a sermon. They're looking for a less formal, a shorter service. To this end, they petitioned Shereth Israel's leaders for the right to establish their own earlier worship service. They say, you don't have to change yours. We would just like to make our own a little bit earlier than yours. You can keep going with your thing and we'll do our thing. Well, this did not go over very well at all. This request revealed a whole series of communal tensions, young versus old, Sephardic versus Ashkenazic, innovators versus traditionalists that had been really simmering in the congregation. The young people's petition was unsurprisingly rejected by the much older Board of Trustees. Meanwhile, in Charleston, a similar situation was brewing. In Charleston in 1820, all Jews over 21 years of age were expected to be members of the synagogue, Beth Elohim, the city's only synagogue. The congregation, as it always had, sought to regulate the behavior of its members. Rules were enforced, Sabbath observance was enforced, intermarriage was outlawed. Members were not allowed to form another congregation. If they did, they would be fined and they would be kicked out of the congregation and its cemetery forever. So members were routinely fined in the Charleston community for violating kashrut, for violating Shabbat, all of these sorts of things. Like all other synagogues in the United States during this period, Beth Elohim operated according to the Sephardic minhag, with prayers in Hebrew, songs in Ladino. By the 1820s, as in New York, many of Beth Elohim's members were native-born. They were thoroughly assimilated. So Beth Elohim's style of Sephardic worship did not resonate with these native-born Jews, many of whom did not understand Hebrew, let alone Ladino or Judeo-Portuguese. Again, this is just like in New York. The Sephardic style of worship did not appeal either to these recently arrived Jews from Central Europe, mostly from the German lands, who preferred an Ashkenazic style of worship. So given this situation, it's unsurprising that in 1824, 47 Charleston Jews, 2/3 of whom were native-born, submitted a petition to Beth Elohim's leadership asking for a shorter service, English translation of the prayers, and a sermon in English that would help them understand the Torah, make the Torah feel alive and feel relevant. The average age of these petitioners was 32. The average age of Beth Elohim's leadership, who considered the petition, was 62. The petition was denied. And here's where it gets really interesting. 12 of the disappointed liberal petitioners resigned from the congregation and organized a separate congregation called the Reformed Society of Israelites. This independent society, led by native-born Jew Isaac Harvey, you can see his silhouette up there on the screen, was influenced by the ideas of the early Reform movement taking hold in Hamburg, Germany. To this end, the Reformed Society dispensed with head coverings. They added musical instruments to their services. The group put together their own prayer book, which you can see up there on the screen. This is considered the first Reformed prayer book ever written in America. This Reformed prayer book contained English translations of most of the prayer service. It also gave women a more prominent role, granted brides a speaking part for the first time in the Jewish wedding liturgy, and included a naming ceremony for baby girls. This new prayer book even contained prayers written by a local Jewish resident, sister of the society's, one of the society's founders, by the name of Caroline Harvey. In New York, too, the young Jewish rebels did not go quietly into the dark night. Instead, they seceded. Young New York Jews left to create the city's first Ashkenazic congregation, B'nai Jeshurun. Yes, it's the same one that still exists today. It was founded in 1825 to be a much less formal, and they believed less elitist congregation than the city's first synagogue, Shereth Israel, from which they broke away. Interestingly, both congregations, Shereth Israel and B'nai Jeshurun, still exist today. And B'nai Jeshurun, in our attempt to always look at the name and think about it for a minute, means upright, just, or straight, which is interesting. Shereth Israel is the remnant of Israel, right? And now B'nai Jeshurun, you have people who are, looking for a straighter path, a more upright path, religious path going forward. With these two actions, which were subsequently emulated in other communities, young American Jews created a religious revolution that overthrew the monolithic synagogue community that had dominated Jewish life since the early colonial era. They created a new American Judaism that was much more democratic, free, diverse, and competitive. It is interesting to note that Protestants were also holding a religious revolution in America during this same period, abandoning denominations which they had been raised in and turning instead into more democratic, inspiring, and authentic denominations, moving, for example, from congregational Presbyterian and Episcopalian churches to those to Methodist, Baptists, and Disciples of Christ. Jews were following a similar sort of pattern, so that henceforward, in larger communities, dissenters no longer sought to compromise their principles for the sake of consensus. Instead, they felt free to withdraw and start their own synagogues, which they did time and again. In New York, there were 2 synagogues in 1825, 4 synagogues in 1835, and 10 in 1845. There were more than 20 synagogues in New York by 1855, and you can see those numbers on your screen. By the time of the American Civil War, every major American Jewish community had at least 2 synagogues, and larger communities like Baltimore and Philadelphia and Cincinnati had 4 or more synagogues. These were not satellite congregations created to meet the needs of a dispersed community or an immigrant community, nor were they congregations that were sanctioned by any kind of central authority. Well, in Western Europe, church and synagogue hierarchies persisted. In free and democratic America, congregational autonomy became the rule in Judaism as well as in Protestantism. Members who were dissatisfied with their own congregation just resigned and created a new one that was more suited to their needs and desires. Some particularly hard-to-please Jews founded several synagogues in succession. The result was nothing less than a new American Judaism, a Judaism that was diverse and pluralistic, where before it had been singular and monolithic. For the first time, American Jews could choose from a number of congregations, reflecting a range of rites, ideologies, and regions of origins. It was inevitable that these synagogues competed with one another for members and status. As a result, they had a new interest in appealing to their members, in satisfying their members, in minimizing dissent. Indeed, synagogue pluralism challenged the balance of power between the synagogue and its members. Before, when there was only one synagogue in the community, you had to follow the rules or you were out. You had no place to worship. Now American Jews had options. And as a result, congregations became much more focused on attracting members than with keeping keeping them in line. One final implication of synagogue pluralism is that it brought an end to that intimate coupling of synagogue and community. In every city where Jews lived, the synagogue community was replaced by a community of synagogues. A single synagogue was no longer able to represent the community as a whole. In fact, synagogues came increasingly to represent the diversity of American Jewish life. To bind the Jewish community together and carry out functions synagogues could no longer handle required new community-wide organizations that were capable of transcending religious differences. Charitable organizations, fraternal organizations soon moved in to fill the void. These organizations and the German Jewish immigrants who had found and run them drive the next chapter of American Jewish life. But we'll save that for our next series, right? I'm going to conclude our conversation about Jews and the American Revolution tonight by asking you what you thought of what you just heard, what surprised you, what interested you, what puzzled you about the impact that Jews had on the American Revolution, and then in turn, the way that the ideas and ideals of the American Revolution trickled down into American Jewish life. I want to give